All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Apologies if you're watching this in the order that I recorded them. It's obviously out of order, but this is the first lecture in the lecture series I'm giving on American literature, history of American literature, American intellectual history. We're going to go from Puritan origins all the way up to the period of postmodernism, post-World War II, so on and so forth, okay? My name is Eric Diamond. I'm going to be your host for this lecture series. And what we're going to do today is actually a variation on what I do in all of my American literature courses. So for those of you who don't know, I've taught at UCLA, I've taught at various survey courses for the English department there, and I've also taught for 5 years at an elite private all-boys school out in Chicago where I taught American Lit for 5 years. So this class I'm going to give you guys is an updated version of the survey courses I've been giving for the past 8 or so years. It's everything I know about American literature that I think an introductory level student should know. And because I'm basing it off the courses I've already done, I'm actually doing what I did for my high school students all 5 years that I taught this course, which is on the first day of class to do an intro to the idea of American identity, of what it means to be an American as both an introduction to course material, but also approaching it as a theme of the course in general, a question that we want to answer. Is there something distinct about American literature? Because this is a question that not a lot of people ask. We talk about, okay, like most American high school students, you're going to have a Brit Lit survey, you're going to have an American literature survey, and you're going to have a World Lit survey, right? You usually have your freshman year course, which is a joke. I remember my freshman year course. It was awful. Then after you're exposed to a wide variety of genres, you read Macbeth, or maybe Romeo and Juliet, you read some short stories, you read some poetry, you read some awful public school literature like I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Whatever, you do all that. Sophomore year, you have Brit Lit survey. Junior year, you have American Lit survey. And then senior year, you do world literature. That's the standard approach in most American high schools. So you have 3 survey courses. And the way that they're taught is just like, hey, we're organizing this material this way because we were kind of told to do it. And it's not, hey, maybe there's something distinct about the American identity against the British identity. Maybe there's something distinct about the Russian identity against the American identity. And maybe there are reasons to approach literature nationally or historically. Like it might be the case that Russian literature is a very different thing than American literature because their histories are different, because their identities are different, because their languages are different, so on and so forth, okay? And most people don't do that. However, I do that. I approach literature through a historicist lens, which is something we're going to be talking about in the coming lectures. And I think it's important right from the outset that we have a clear idea of what we mean by American literature, why we want to read American literature, specifically historically, going from the Puritans to post-World War II period. What are the advantages to that approach against the approach of, hey, let's just, like the great books thing you see, particularly in a lot of like Christian Catholic education, which is the world that I come from. We should just read the best. Well, no one's going to say, like, I like Jonathan Edwards, don't get me wrong. In fact, I almost specialized in doing Puritan literature. Like, I like Jonathan Edwards a lot, but I'm not going to say Jonathan Edwards is the best of all world literature authors. Jonathan Edwards was a genius. I enjoy Jonathan Edwards. But when you read most of the Puritan stuff, particularly the bad stuff like Mary Rowlandson, when you're reading, I don't know, the Cotton's Rejoinder, like all these weird documents, you're not going to go, okay, this is the best that's been written. So the question is, well, why do we read it? Why do American literature survey courses start with the Puritans? And the idea that I want to approach in this lecture is there is a clear American idea that evolves from origins, and then if you follow that origin story, you can actually see the development of this idea, and you'll come to understand what I see as one of the most important things within our contemporary context. Why are Americans the way they are? Like, what is the distinctness of being an American? Why are we in the situation that we're in geopolitically, culturally, so on and so forth? Those are questions that can only be approached when we read the literature with the clear question of not why is this the best literature, why is this moving, why is this approaching great themes, but instead, what is this saying about a historical people in a given historical context? And to that end, as I was mentioning, I always begin with this lecture in my high school classes. Well, in my high school classes, their summer reading is quite light, to be honest. I always joke with them. You guys complain that you have to read a 340-page novel, but it's a children's novel, and you guys are 15, 16 years old. Let's not complain about this. They have to read Huckleberry Finn, which is not bad. When I was in high school, it was 4 books for the American literature course you had to read over the summer. You had to read Huckleberry Finn, you had to read The Scarlet Letter, you had to read Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, and you had to read Daisy Miller. Phenomenal choices. I wish I could have done the same thing when I was teaching. It just wasn't feasible. The boys complain too much. They have all these summer programs, whatever. But they did, allegedly. We found out when they had their summer reading test that this was not always the case. But they allegedly read Huckleberry Finn. So I approached this by saying, hey, we're going to talk about this idea of American identity by looking at just the first and last page of Huckleberry Finn. And so to that end, and I'll mention this again later, this lecture is going to spoil Huckleberry Finn for you. So if you haven't read Huckleberry Finn, you may just want to skip ahead to the other lectures. In most cases, we're proceeding by reading. And so you do the reading, do the reading, do the reading. This is actually not my full lecture on Huckleberry Finn. I'm going to do that later when we get to the realism unit. But before we begin with Puritanism, I begin with this sort of sub-tiny unit on American identity. And because my students have read Huckleberry Finn over the summer, I talk a little bit about Huckleberry Finn. But we're not going to go too in depth. But if you haven't read it and you're really if you're really concerned about spoilers, then you may not want to listen to this. But I'll also say, as a side note, don't be too concerned about spoilers. When you're reading literature as a scholar, we're not so much concerned about plot. We're not so much concerned about the entertainment value of literature. We're concerned with the scholarly approach and what it has to say about larger ideas. And so I read the plots of novels I haven't read all the time. I've had tons of novels spoiled for me in my time as a literature scholar because that's just part of the job when you approach literature through this more academic lens. Okay? In any case, let's go ahead and get started. So moving in, let's see here. There we go. What is the American identity? This is the big question we're going to be asking today. Why are Americans different from Mexicans? Why are Americans different from the French? Why are Americans different from Nigerians, from the Chinese? These are big questions because the idea that we want to get at, what we're trying to understand when we approach literature through this national lens is what makes Americans distinct from other people? What are the big ideas that we have that other people do not share? And actually, in an article I was reading about Perry Miller, you may not know, Perry Miller is probably the most famous scholar of American intellectual history, of American Puritanism, and of early American literature that we have. If you've heard of the discipline of American Studies, maybe you have a minor program or a major program in American Studies. Perry Miller invented American Studies. Now, today he's persona non grata. Not a lot of intellectuals like him. In the certain academic mode that we live in, he's not a very popular person. I love Perry Miller. I'm very much indebted to Perry Miller. But Perry Miller has this sort of quote where he's saying, listen, if you're born French, if you're born Spanish, if you're born Hungarian, you're not constantly asking yourself the question, what does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be Hungarian? What does it mean to be Spanish? What does it mean to be German? You have a clear language, you have a clear ethnos, you have a clear religious structure. Germany a little complicated, but in general, you have a clear religious structure. Your architecture has a certain coherence, the music, the literature, so on and so forth. It's very obvious that if you're French, you speak French on a day-to-day basis, you're surrounded by French people, you're surrounded by French ideas, music, French geography, so on and so forth. In the American context, this is really complicated because one, our country's so big, we don't have a common geography. Two, we don't have a common language. That wasn't true in the colonial period, and it's certainly not true now. There's never been a time in this country where it is just a clear, unambiguous, everyone speaks English country. And we're not the English. We're not the same thing as British people at all. If you're American and you're watching this, you'll know. You'll crack up thinking, okay, yeah, obviously we're not like British people. If you've met British people, you know. British people and American people, very different. You watch British television, you watch American television, you watch American films, you watch British films, you'll understand that those are two very different things. And so Perry Miller makes the point that Americans are very self-conscious about American identity because there's not a clear thing that groups them. There's no such thing as the American ethnicity. You have WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who have dominated the country roughly through the period of up to World War II. After World War II, you could talk about the decline in WASP power, WASP ascendancy, WASP sort of cultural capital. That goes down. But in general, we don't have an ethnos. There's no common American ethnic identity, which is why you don't walk down the street and go, "Greetings, fellow American." The way that people, for example, in Mexico, they talk about compatriota, right? Like a paisano, right? He's my countryman. He's someone that I share a country with. We're part of a large collective family. Russians see the nation this way, particularly in the period of the Tsar, right? The Tsar is the head of the family. He's the patriarch. He's the head of the Russian people. And all Russian people, even if they don't share a common religion, even if in some cases they don't share a common language, a common ethnos, they're all part of this family of Russians that has a clear father figure. Well, Americans, being a democracy, we don't have a clear father figure. We don't have a clear ethnic unity. We don't have a clear linguistic unity. We don't have a clear cultural unity. And so in that case, we're much more like the Roman Empire. We're not an ethnos. We are not a people bound by a common set of historical experiences, a common biology, so on and so forth. We are a demos. We are a people bound together by a common cultural project and by a common political unity. In the case of the Roman Empire, that was obviously the empire. In our case, it's not so much an empirical, or what would you want to say, an imperial institution as it is a common set of ideas in support of liberalism and liberal democracy. This would be the case that I argue. But America is a propositional nation. You may have heard that term before, propositional nationhood. America is a nation that is based on an idea, a common cultural goal. And this is expressed in things that you have probably heard of at some point. The American dream. The American dream is part of our propositional nationhood. Or the idea of the self-made man. Or the idea of rights, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, so on and so forth. These are things that make up the American identity. You see those symbols everywhere right about this time of year with the 4th of July. But they're based on a proposition that is offered to the peoples who become Americans, saying, hey, this is a core set of values that we believe in. We don't have ethnic unity. We don't have linguistic unity. We don't have even a historical unity that other peoples have. We're a relatively young nation, only about, depending on how you want to reckon it, 400, 300, 200 years old. We don't have any of those larger unities that Italy has, for example, or that Turkey has. We just don't have that. So instead, here's the proposition that we offer. Okay? What are the salient characteristics that make us us? This is what we're going to try to answer in this lecture and throughout the entire lecture series. Example, I always give this as an example. I ask the class, how many of you have had your parents, usually a mom, tell you at some point in your life, you can be anything you want? You want to be an astronaut, you can be an astronaut. You want to be a businessman, you can be a businessman. You want to be president of the United States, you can be president of the United States. You want to be a judge, you can be a judge. You can be literally anything. Kidney doctor, you can be a kidney doctor. And I say, okay, imagine you're born in Mozambique. Not to pick on Mozambique, but it's just the case. Let's imagine you're not even born in the capital of Maputo. You're born out in the countryside in Mozambique. Do you think the mom in Mozambique goes up to her children and says, you can be anything you want? You can be a famous American football player. You can be an athlete. Well, no, it's not going to happen, right? They have exigencies as part of their, what do you want to call it, their day-to-day life in the environment in which they live, partially cultural, partially economic, partially just sort of based on the need for survival, that do not let them have that set of beliefs. There probably is a set of beliefs that are common to the people of Mozambique that are partially shaped by the geography, partially shaped by the experience of colonialism, partially shaped by the use of the Portuguese language, so on and so forth. But they're not going to say you can be anything you want. The idea you can be anything you want is a very distinctly American idea. And it's spread to other countries through the influence of, you could say, American geopolitics, American foreign policy, American culture, spread through institutions like Netflix, the internet, so on and so forth. But you can be anything you want is a very distinctly American phrase. We can see that in other countries, that's not really what you're told. Or if you are told that, it's not the most important thing. Maybe in China, people do say to their children, you can be anything you want. But in China, the idea you can be anything you want at the expense of your family, at the expense of the health of the larger civil society, so on and so forth, based on the Confucian ideals generally shared by the Chinese people, that's just not going to be compatible. It's just that level of hyper-individualism, self-made man, rags to riches, so on and so forth. It's just not compatible with the Chinese idea. And so to that end, what I want to talk about is you see this in all these different phrases that we use, but also in symbols and archetypes. Let's go back for a moment. Symbols and archetypes. And if you don't know what an archetype is, I'm going to have a lecture on just the vocab for this unit posted probably sometime later this week. But an archetype just means literally arc, like big, grand, or great, type. And type just means symbol. And so an archetype is a symbol that is common to a large group of people. So, for example, if you've heard of the literary critic and psychologist Joseph Campbell, he's basing this on the ideas of Carl Jung, who talked about a collective unconscious, a sort of unconscious that is common to all of humanity. And one of the big archetypes, in this case not a national archetype, but an archetype that is shared by all human beings, for Joseph Campbell is this idea of the monomyth, that there is one universal story that is presented in all human epics, and it involves certain key characteristics. One of which, for example, the protagonist of the monomyth or of the epic will encounter a wise old man figure. The wise old man is an archetype that is common across all civilizations and societies and cultures. So, for example, Gandalf is a wise old man. Tiresias in the Odyssey is a wise old man. Who else do you have? Merlin is a wise old man. So on and so forth. Like, it doesn't matter what culture you look at, you will see the figure of the wise old man. Now, some archetypes are national archetypes. They're specific to a particular group of people. So, for example, an American archetype, I would say, is the self-made man. The person who starts from the bottom, but through their hard work and ingenuity, makes something of their life and goes up in the social ladder in a way that wasn't really possible in Europe. Andrew Carnegie, perfect example. He's part of our collective cultural identity. He starts at the absolute bottom as an immigrant. He learns how to read and write. He gets a job as a secretary. Later, he's the biggest steel magnate in the entire country, probably the entire world. I don't know that much about the business side of American history, but that's a clear example of the self-made man archetype. Well, one archetype, and the archetype we're going to look at today, is this idea of the orphan. I'll stop clicking. The idea of the orphan. Orphans are an extremely common symbol or archetype in the American national consciousness. And I would say also just the hemispheric consciousness. You see this in South America. You see this in other parts of North America, like Mexico. But I would say it's most salient in the United States. The idea of a child who does not have parents. And this is seen, rather than being as a negative thing, it's seen as a positive thing. And I'll tell a little bit of a story related to this. So the first teaching demonstration I ever did was a variant of this lecture, much more simplified, much more focused just on the book itself, just on this guy right here, Huckleberry Finn. And in that lecture, I was talking about, Huckleberry Finn, his father's not in the picture, mother we don't seem to know anything about, he takes Jim as an adopted father, he lives this life of absolute freedom, all the stuff I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. And observing me was the teacher. He had his doctorate. He was actually like a PhD level guy, very, very smart guy, of British literature. He was sitting in the back of the room taking notes, and at the end of my lecture he said, that was a good job, so on and so forth. But he said, it's just so funny to me because this entire lecture I was thinking about Oliver Twist, because he taught all these different courses on Dickens, both at the high school and the college level. It's so interesting because Huckleberry Finn, at the end of Huckleberry Finn, which we're going to talk about today, he wants to be an orphan. He wants absolute freedom. He does not want a father figure. He does not want a mother figure. He rejects civil society. But if you read Oliver Twist, it's the exact opposite. For Oliver Twist, the worst thing in the world is being an orphan. The worst thing in the world is not having parents, is not being connected to a society, is not being vinculated in some way with other human beings. But for Huckleberry Finn, that's exactly what he wants. I mean, think about this for a moment. I do some examples with American folk music. We're not going to look at those now. But if you're a Marty Robbins fan, for example, a song like Saddle Tramp, you're a Tom Waits fan, you could Woke Up This Morning with the Cold Water. I think the song is just called Cold Water, off Mule Variations. You could look at how much we idolize tramps, bums, hobos, people who ride the rails. You could look at all sorts of different collective symbols that we have where we put this sort of excess value on people who do not have parents. You'll see this later when we get to modernism. The big focus in that modernism unit is the novel that every American high schooler reads. Hopefully you've already read it, The Great Gatsby. If you haven't read it, you'll read it with me when we go through this lecture series. But without spoiling too much, Gatsby, in a certain sense, is also an orphan. Gatsby, much like Huckleberry Finn, and by the way, we'll see this in the Enlightenment too, much like Benjamin Franklin, they're all, to greater or lesser degrees, orphans, and they're usually orphans by choice. Like Huck still has a dad, Ben Franklin still has a dad, as you'll see, Gatsby still has a dad. But they all separate from the family structure In some cases, they change their names, so on and so forth, but they become something independent of their civil society. And we as Americans love that. This is a cultural symbol that has so much resonance with us that it's hard actually to overstate how much we like this. And I give this example, if there's probably like a 2% chance of this. If you're a female watching this, maybe you haven't had this experience, but all of my male students, which I taught at an all-boys school for 5 years, so that was pretty much all of my students. All of my male students will immediately understand this. Every single American boy has had the experience of looking out the window in class, bored. For me, it was a math class. And you look out the window and you think, I just love to run away. I just love to go to the hills, live out in the woods, hunt and fish, and just be away. Live survivor man lifestyle. And that's a super American thing. Other people don't think that. In other cultures, for example, like I know this is for a case in Mexican culture. I spent a lot of time in Mexico. When I visit Orizaba, beautiful, beautiful pueblo, right, city. I mean, it's bigger than that. It's like 100,000 people. But there's this beautiful Mexican city. It's out in the hills of Veracruz. Beautiful green rolling hills, mountains, so on and so forth. And my instinct looking at them was always, oh, that's like, let's go hiking. I want to go hike up there, so on and so forth. And some people do hike, and it's becoming more popular. But the prevailing attitude of people in Orizaba was, but everything is down here in the village. Why would you want to go out in the mountains? The mountains are dangerous. There's animals, there's spiders, there's scorpions, there's all sorts of dangerous people. Everything good is here at home. We got TV, we've got food, we've got, beer, we've got all the family, friends, like all the nice stuff is in town. Why would you want to go to the hills? But Americans, because of our distinct cultural, because of our distinct shared history, we look out the window and we just fantasize about getting away from it all. I mean, even now it sounds kind of romantic, right? And that's part and parcel of these symbols and archetypes that we're going to talk about in the introduction to Huckleberry Finn. And the point that I want to make with all of this is to say, precisely because, like, for example, the mother in Mozambique is not looking out the window at the sort of harsh jungle conditions of Mozambique and thinking, wouldn't it be great to just get away from the village? Well, she has a different experience than us, but Americans do think that way. And the whole point of this is to say, because our symbols are different, because our proverbs are different, because our literatures are different, we are different. Americans have a common experience that is unique to Americans precisely on the basis of this shared culture. Okay, this is the idea that I want to get at. American literature is not the same thing as Nigerian literature. American literature is not the same thing as British literature. In fact, going back to the Oliver Twist point, it's the opposite. Oliver Twist desperately wants to not be an orphan. He wants to be adopted. He wants to live the Bilbo Baggins life, which, by the way, Bilbo Baggins produced by an Englishman. There's no one more English than J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien's whole thing is, where do they live? The Shire. The Shire is the English countryside. It's got you got the pub, you can smoke, you got your little hobbit hole, everybody eats nice, everybody knows each other, nothing ever happens, time moves slowly, and that's like paradise. That's like the greatest thing on earth. Whereas for Americans, what Oliver Twist wants is exactly what we're trying to avoid, and as we'll see in a moment, it's what Huck is trying to avoid as well. So, as I mentioned, we're going to start with Huckleberry Finn. You should know this is like one of the foundational documents of American literature and American culture. And I'm going to talk about this in relation to this guy in a moment, T.S. Eliot. But yeah, Huckleberry Finn is like a definitive part of the American canon. It's one of the most important books that we have. In fact, T.S. Eliot, I'll actually read the quote now. I like it a lot. He says, Huck Finn is alone. There is no more solitary character in fiction. The fact that he has a father only emphasizes his loneliness, and he views his father with a terrifying detachment. So we come to see Huck himself in the end as one of permanent symbolic figures of fiction, not unworthy to take a place with Ulysses, Faust, Don Quixote, Don Juan, Hamlet, and other great discoveries that man has made about himself. So Eliot's claim is huge. He's saying Huck Finn is a sort of new innovation in literature. He's a new character, and he's a character that represents a civilizational tendency the way that Ulysses does. Ulysses, or Odysseus, is a representation of Greek culture. He is the Greek man writ large. Faust is the Germanic or the Western man writ large. In fact, I think Carl Schmitt, who, believe it or not, I know Carl Schmitt's political philosophy, don't want to get into all that right now, but Carl Schmitt was a phenomenal literary critic, and one of his books, actually on Hamlet, he makes the case that Faust is the definitive, what do you call it, personification or concretization of Protestant Europe. The character that Protestant Europe produced, or the great literary figure that Protestant Europe produced, was Faust. And then he made the case that Don Quixote, and I would also add in Don Juan, are the definitive productions of Catholic culture. That Catholic European civilization produces the figure of Don Quixote and of Don Juan as sort of concretizations of its unique cultural heritage. And then he says Hamlet is the sort of middle point, which is Anglicanism, right? But Eliot is making the claim that Huck Finn stands alone. He's a literary figure of tremendous importance for us as Americans, that he is, in some sense, our epic hero. And it's no surprise, many people say Huckleberry Finn is the great American novel. I would not be one of them. I appreciate Huckleberry Finn very much. I like the novel. I understand its cultural significance. To call it the great American novel, I think, is a little bit of an exaggeration, but there is something to it. There's no doubt that Huckleberry Finn is a foundational character, and in that the novel itself is a foundational piece of American literature. Standard summer reading across the country. As I mentioned, I'm going to spoil the ending, but it's going to give us a sense of what we want to look for in subsequent texts. Like I mentioned, once you see the pattern in Huckleberry Finn, you'll see it in Gatsby. You'll see it in A Streetcar Named Desire. You'll see it in Death of a Salesman. Like you'll see it over and over and over again in all these different texts that we're going to read throughout this course. Okay, so moving forward, I already read the quote. I mean, what Eliot is basically doing here, and if you don't know, Eliot is, I mean, some people say he's a British figure because he, in truth be told, he does abandon America and to a certain extent becomes British. But Eliot is an American/British poet, modernist, one of the most famous poets that we have, won the Nobel Prize for his great poem, The Wasteland. Actually, no, excuse me, it was for 4 quartets. Personally, one of my favorite poets, if not my favorite poet, and a phenomenal literary critic as well. And this is from an essay he wrote about Huckleberry Finn. And he's making the case here, and the reason why I introduced these quotes is that, one, Huckleberry Finn is a foundational character for American literature, but that, two, Huckleberry Finn is foundational precisely because of 2 factors. And I didn't include the one quote that addresses this. The one factor is the river, which we'll talk about when we deal with Huckleberry Finn more generally when we get to realism. But the second foundational factor is the fact that Huck is an orphan, and that Huck is the narrator of the novel. Eliot makes a big deal of the fact that Huck does not have a father, and we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit. But with no further ado, I actually want to look at a couple paragraphs of the opening of Huckleberry Finn, as I mentioned, and try to see them as a microcosm for what the novel is dealing with as a whole. And then we're going to look at the ending of Huckleberry Finn, and I'll try to show you, okay, based on both the introduction and the conclusion, what claim, not that Mark Twain consciously thought about this, but what claim is being made about American identity? Why is it the case that Huck is an orphan, and why is it the case that Huckleberry Finn resonates so much with us? What is it about his orphanness that we find culturally resonant in a way that maybe someone from Mozambique, maybe someone from China would not find as culturally resonant? And without any further ado, let me actually I'll read these first 2 paragraphs, and then we'll start to do a little bit of breakdown, a little bit of analysis. So, in case you don't already know, these are the opening lines of Huckleberry Finn. And forgive me, my accent's going to be very poor, but I'll do what I can. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There was some things which he stretched, but he mainly told the truth. That is nothing. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly, or the widow, or maybe Mary. Aunt Polly, Tom's Aunt Polly she is, and Mary, and the widow Douglas is all told about in that book, which is mostly a true book with some stretchers, as I said before. Now, the way the book winds up is this. Tom and me found the money that the robbers hid in a cave, and it made us rich. We got $6,000 apiece, all gold. It was an awful sight of money when it was piled up. Well, Judge Thatcher, he took it and put it out at interest, and it fetched us $1 a day apiece all the year round, more than a body could tell what to do with. The widow Douglas, she took me for her son, and allowed she would civilize me. But it was rough living in the house all the time, considering how dismal, regular, and decent the widow was in all her ways. And so when I couldn't stand it no longer, I lit out. Keyword, I lit out, meaning I left. I fled. I got into my old rags and my sugar hogshead again and was free and satisfied. But Tom Sawyer, he hunted me up and said he was going to start a band of robbers, and I might join him if I would go back to the widow and be respectable. So I went back. Okay, I love this. Sorry, can I move this? Is it going to let me move this? Maybe it won't let me move it. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I love this. I think it's such a phenomenal opening to the novel. You have the whole question of verisimilitude and realism, which we're going to skip over a little bit. Hawk opens by introducing himself as the narrator, establishing continuity with Tom Sawyer, and basically saying Tom Sawyer had some stretchers, it had some things that weren't the truth, but the things that he tells you are going to be the truth. And it establishes him as someone who's young, someone who's a little bit ingenuous or naive, but someone who's eminently authentic and likable. A little bit naive, a little bit doesn't understand the way of the world, but very, very likable right from the outset. What he gives us is a brief recap of the plot of the adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is they find this treasure that robbers hid in a cave. They each get $6,000. Now, you can look that up adjusted for inflation. That's about $200,000 a piece. And so Huck is 14 years old. He could never use all that money. The judge basically is going to hold it in a trust, and he's going to give him $1 a day based on the interest that this money accrues. Which, if you look it up, $1 a day is it's something ridiculous. It's like $150 a day. If you're 14 years old, you might be able to spend that one day and then the next day. But after a while, you're not even going to be able to spend all that money. And as you can tell from the introduction, Huck doesn't really care about the money. He's not motivated by the money. In fact, the widow Douglas, this old widow, adopts him and says she's going to civilize him. She takes her for her son, so Huck becomes adopted. He becomes part of a family structure, and he's going to learn the ways of civil society. He's going to learn how to eat. He's going to learn how to have manners. He's going to learn how to be a gentleman, functionally. But he said he didn't like it. Huck is sort of he's got an animal presence. He eats when he's hungry. He drinks when he's thirsty. He sleeps when he's tired. He doesn't like having to do things around the clock. He doesn't like this sort of organizational structure. It was dismal regular. And so he decides to light out, meaning to flee, and he goes back to his sugar hogshead. So think about this for a moment. Sugar hogshead, if you don't know, is just a barrel. Huck has all this money to be living lavish lifestyle if he wants. In fact, I would make the case that the only characters in all of Huckleberry Finn who are richer than Huckleberry Finn are probably just the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords. Everyone else in Huckleberry Finn probably has less money than Huck. But Huck wants to live in a barrel. The money doesn't change him. What he wants is to live the life he's always lived, which is freedom. It doesn't matter if he has to live in a barrel. His freedom is more important to him. That's a very key point. He views the luxuries as in some way being changed. Now, if you're Oliver Twist, if you're Dickens, the luxuries, the family life, the creature comforts, the sort of Hobbit Shire things, those are the ideals. But for Huck, he says, no, that's not what I want. I just want to be out on the road. Think about that. We'll read Jack Kerouac's On the Road in this class. Very, very similar themes. The goal is travel. It is to not have a home. It's like if you listen to the song, if you haven't listened to it, go listen to it. Marty Robbins' Saddle Tramp. You go listen to Saddle Tramp, you'll hear this. I'm free as the breeze and I ride where I please. He's not going to be tied down. He just wants to go and go and go. Cowboys, pioneers, all these people who just flee and desire this sort of state of absolute freedom, Huck is on their side. He wants to live in the hogshead. He does not want to live in civil society. But Tom Sawyer, who represents the civilizational principle, you'll see this throughout the novel, he hunts him up and says we're going to start this band of robbers, come back to the widow, be civilized, just do what she tells you to do. And so Huck acquiesces. And moving on to the next paragraph, let's see here. The widow, she cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb. And she called me a lot of other names too, but she never meant no harm by it. She put me in them new clothes again, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Well then, the old thing commenced again. The widow rung a bell for supper, and you had to come to time. When you got to the table, you couldn't go right to eatin', but had to wait for the widow to tuck her head down and grumble a little over the victuals, though there weren't really anything the matter with them. That is, not only everything was cooked by itself. In a barrel of odds and ends, it is different. Things get mixed up and the juice kind of swaps around, and things go better. After supper, she got her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat to find out all about him. But by and by, she let it out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time, so then I didn't care no more about him, because I don't take no stock in dead people. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke, and I asked the widow to let me, but she wouldn't. She said it was a mean practice, and it wasn't clean, and that I must try not to do it anymore. That is just the way with some people. They get down on a thing when they don't know nothing about it. Here she was bothering about Moses, which was no kin to her and no use to anybody being gone, you see. Yet finding a power of fault with me for doing a thing that had some good in it. And she took snuff, too. Of course that was all right, because she had done it herself. Good. Okay, so I love this. Huck takes no stock in dead people. So he has to learn how to eat. He doesn't like it. He likes all of his food mixed up. You could even think like analogously with American immigration, the sort of plurality of religions, the plurality of American identity, that there's something even American in that Huck doesn't want the food separated and organized. He wants it all mixed together. There is something to that, though I understand some of you may think that's a stretch. But what's interesting here is the talk about Moses. So the widow Douglas wants to give Huck a sort of standard American Protestant religious education. She reads the Bible to him. And Huck hears the story about Moses and he gets super excited. But the moment he finds out Moses is dead, doesn't want anything to do with Moses. He takes no stock in dead people, which is interesting. You're going to see this in Gatsby too, with the figure of Meyer Wolfsheim, and also with a certain sense of Gatsby. And you'll see this through many of the novels we'll read in this course. Huck has no interest in the past. And you sort of put all these things together. Orphan, father not in the picture, mother not in the picture, absolute desire for freedom, no interest in the past. Well, what is American about this? Well, let's go back to the founding of America, the distinct moment that separated us as a nation from the British. Why are we not British culturally if we speak English, if we share a language? And if to a certain extent, for the first 100 years of American history, if we shared an ethnos with Britain, why are we not British? Why are we so different from British people? Well, what is the thing that separates us from the British? The establishing of American independence. You have the separation of the American state from the monarchy. That is huge. Can't overstate that enough. And the founding of a new political form, which is this Republican democracy. And so American republicanism and the American Republican tradition, liberalism, the anti-monarchical sentiment, which is present even earlier, right? Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. Many of the regicides of Charles I actually flee to the United States. And Nathaniel Hawthorne writes about that a lot. But the American identity is based on this key moment of we are going to establish a new nation with new political principles on the basis of severing ourselves from the fatherland, from the motherland, from the patriarch, from the king, who's the father to the people. And we're going to separate ourselves, and we're going to create something new. Okay, so think about that for a moment. First, that's patricide. That is voluntarily choosing to become an orphan. We choose to disinherit ourselves from our cultural, religious, political, ethnic legacy and become something different. We separate ourselves from the family. America in 1776 does what Huck does. He lights out. He flees. Well, America does the same thing. And so to that extent, America becomes an orphan nation. Alienated from the fatherland, alienated from the motherland, alienated from the patriarch. It also becomes a nation without history because it separates itself from the history of the English people, which goes back, well over 1,000 years. Much like the history of the Spanish people, the history of the Hungarian people, the history of the Turkish people, the history of the Chinese people, which goes back even further. America had a history like that, but it separates itself from it. And to that extent, everything in America becomes new. America is all about newness and innovation rather than cultural continuity. Make it new, make it new, make it new. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, we'll look at this quote when we talk about the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson actually has a quote where he says, in America, the buildings should be destroyed every 50 years so that we never have to occupy the thoughts of dead people. Because think about it, if you live in a building that's more than 50 years old, which chances are, if you're watching this, think about how old the building you're in is. I guarantee you it's probably not even 30 or 40 years old. It's only, if you're in America, it's a minority of you who are in a building that's older than 30 or 40 years old. And why is that? Well, Americans like things that are new. You can't find anything in America that's more than 100 years old. I mean, most of you, unless you made some conscious effort to go see historical sites, which are mostly reconstructed anyway. You go to Colonial Williamsburg or whatever, it's all reconstructions. But unless you've made some conscious effort, you really only are surrounded by things that are less than 100 years old at all times in America. Everything is new. Whereas in England, that's not the case. You go, there's Stonehenge, there's Roman ruins, there's a castle, there's, Westminster Abbey, whatever. You see all these old buildings all the time. You're in Italy, you're surrounded, like if you're in Rome, you're surrounded by Italian history. Whereas Americans, everything is new. partially because of that separation, partially because of a cultural desire that results from that separation. And so Huck, like Americans, doesn't really care that much about history and doesn't really care that much about family. He wants independence. And even the separation from the family structure is independence from genealogy. Genealogy is, you had a father, your father had a father, your father's father had a father, your father's father's father had a father, and going all the way back to basically all those people who came to make you had a history, and you are the inheritor of that history. Well, America, in rejecting the father, in rejecting the mother, in rejecting the family, in rejecting the monarchy, makes itself independent from genealogy, and to that extent, makes itself independent from history, which is why I would say, to this very day, Americans don't care that much about genealogy compared to other peoples, and Americans don't care that much about history. And you can see this in many different cultural forms. You watch an HBO miniseries on, I don't know, the Borgias, or whatever period drama that Americans like to watch, it always tries to make everybody seem super contemporary. This is, and I'll go on a tangent just because it's a fun one, this is my huge objection. My students would make fun of me for this all the time. This is my huge objection to the new Gatsby movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. I love the Robert Redford Gatsby movie, but the new one is awful. And I've never seen it, okay? I've only seen the trailer. I refuse to watch it. But from the trailer, you watch it, and this is allegedly taking place in the Roaring 20s, and all of a sudden, No Church in the Wild starts playing, and everybody's dancing in this crazy way that's not the Charleston. And basically, the message that the trailer gives off is, hey, American youth, you like to go to crazy, degenerate college parties, like fraternity party, drinking out of a keg type stuff. Well, your ancestors 100 years ago liked to party too, and so there's no fundamental difference between you and them. History means nothing. History doesn't separate you at all. Everybody liked the things that you, as a liberal democratic subject, enjoy. So you like going to college parties, you like living for the moment, you like this style of music, you have these particular set of values, you're not interested in family and history. Well, neither were your ancestors. This is the idea. Now, is there continuity? To be sure. But Americans, whenever they look into the past, they always see a reflection of the present. And I would say that has to do with what Huck says here about not taking stock in dead people. Let's focus on the now. Let's focus on the present. We have disinherited ourselves from the past. Good. Let's move forward. So we've got this last part of the introduction, and then we'll take a look at the conclusion. Her sister, Miss Watson, a tolerable slim old maid with goggles on, had just come to live with her, and took a set at me now with a spelling book. She worked me middlin' hard for about an hour, and then the widow made her ease up. I couldn't have stood it much longer. Then for an hour it was deadly dull, and I was fidgety. Miss Watson would say, "Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry," and "Don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry, set up straight." And pretty soon she would say, "Don't gap and stretch like that, Huckleberry. Why don't you try to behave?" Then she told me all about the bad place, and I said I wished I was there. She got mad then, but I didn't mean no harm. All I wanted was to go somewheres. All I wanted was a change. I weren't particular. She said it was wicked to say what I said. She said she wouldn't say it for the whole world. She was going to live so as to go to the good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage in going where she was going, so I made up my mind I wouldn't try for it. But I never said so because it would only make trouble, and it wouldn't do no good. So Huck says, hey, I want to go to hell. Which, by the way, he'll say again later. Everyone makes this out to be like, oh, this is the climactic moment of the novel where Huck learns what conscience is. I think that's a load of garbage. We'll look at that in the full series on Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. We'll get to it later in this lecture series. I think that's such garbage. I hate that reading. But we'll ignore that for a moment. What I find interesting here is Huck says, hell sounds good just because it's a change, which is like, there is nothing more American than that. One thing that maybe if you don't have friends who are were born in different countries and different cultures, you don't know this, but in other cultures, moving is super uncommon. Now, it's becoming more common with globalization, the Americanization of the Western world more generally. But the idea of moving constantly as being a desirable thing, oh, I want to travel. I'm going to move to a new apartment every 2 years in a different city and do this, that. And I'm not going to establish any roots or try to have a house or this, that, the other. That's a super American phenomenon. And you see this here with Huck, where Huck basically says travel, speed, go from destination to destination to destination, always be moving, never settle down, never establish roots. You see that in Saddle Tramp. You see that in cowboys. You see that in hobos. You see that in all sorts of different American archetypal figures. who are on the move, who don't want to establish roots, who want to preserve at all possible costs independence, freedom. And that becomes relevant with the conclusion, which we're going to look at right now. So let's take a look at this, and as I'm reading this, I just want you to consider what is unique about this ending in relation to the introduction to the novel, and what does this ending say about the American identity in relation to what I've already talked about? And I think you probably have an idea, especially if you already know how it ends, but I'll go ahead and read it for you again. And then Tom, he talked along and says, let's all three slide out of here one of these nights and get an outfit and go for howling adventures amongst the Injuns over in the territory for a couple weeks or two. And I says, all right, that suits me, but I ain't got no money to buy the outfit. And I reckon I couldn't get none from home because it's likely Pap's been back before now and got it all away from Judge Thatcher and drunk it up. No, he ain't, Tom says. It's all there yet, $6,000 and more. And your pap ain't ever been back since. Hand it when I come away, anyhow. Jim says, kind of solemn, he ain't coming back no more, Huck. I says, why, Jim? Never mind why, Huck, but he ain't coming back no more. But I kept at him, so at last he says, don't you remember that house that was floating down the river, and there was a man in there covered up, and I went in and uncovered him, and it didn't let you come in? Well, then you're going to get your money when you wants it, 'cause that was him. Tom's most well now, and he got his bullet around his neck on a watch guard for a watch, and is always seeing what time it is, and so there ain't nothing more to write about. And I'm rotten glad of it, because if I'd have knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it, and ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I gotta light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally says she's gonna adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. The end. Okay, and wonderful. Just notice that. Territory, capitalized, and the same thing he says from right in the beginning. He's gonna light out. So the opening of the novel is Huck lighting out to go back and live in his hogshead and fleeing the Widow Douglas. Tom forces him to come back through certain circumstances that happen later. He flees again. And now Tom is basically brought back into civil society. Hey, you got your money back. You can live a life of comfort. You can live with Aunt Sally. All these good things. And Huck says, no, I'm going to go out to the territory. Like Oklahoma. I'm going to go live with Native Americans. Why? I do not want to be a part of civil society. I want to preserve my independence at any cost. And this is one of the interesting things that the critic T.S. Eliot says about the novel, is that it has the quality of the river. It begins and ends in the same place, or it begins as it ends, or it's an eternal cycle of I am forced to come back to civil society, I flee, forced to come back to civil society, flee, and it's an eternal cycle, like a river. River starts, river ends, it goes in the ocean, it evaporates, and then you have the water cycle, and it just continues forever. A river is just constantly in motion. Well, Huck, like the river, is constantly in motion. And he always wants to flee civil society. He always wants to be the orphan, to have no gods and no masters. No one above him, no one below him, pure, autonomous, individual freedom. That's the American idea. And that's why we like Huck Finn. We like Huck Finn as a novel because we see ourselves reflected in Huck Finn. All Americans, or anyone who's been in America for any significant amount of time, by a sort of cultural osmosis, you pick up on this atmospheric liberalism and these atmospheric desires, and you come to make them your own and appropriate them. Like even I, who as you'll see throughout this course, have a lot of critical things to say about the American identity, about American culture, about American geopolitics, foreign policy, whatever. But like when Huck says that, I think about my own life and the circumstances that I'm in, and I just go, oh my goodness, I can relate to that in a way that, whatever, someone in Hungary, someone in China, someone in Russia might not relate to this. But I see myself in Huck Finn. I can see myself in Gatsby. And hopefully you, as you're listening to this, if you're American, you go, yeah, I can see myself in that too. And even if you're not American, to the extent that your culture has been Americanized, if you know English, you are to a certain extent Americanized. If you've ever watched Netflix, you are to a certain extent Americanized. I think you would recognize that to a certain extent you can recognize some of yourself in this too. Huckleberry Finn desires absolute freedom. He is an American archetype because he represents, in a microcosm, the history of our country in a macrocosm. The history of America is fleeing the fatherland and motherland, whether it's through the immigrants or whether it's through the sort of forceful, violent separation that we see in 1776, separating ourselves from history, separating ourselves from family, separating ourselves from genealogy, and making something of ourselves, the American self-fashioning. and fashioning ourselves in such a way that we put freedom first, that we put independence above all other goals. Huck represents that, and for that reason, Huck is like us. Okay, I'm going to conclude things there. The next lecture we're going to go on to, we'll talk a little bit about the vocab for this unit. We'll go a bit more into the idea of American identity generally without looking at any specific novels, and then we'll start to move into Puritanism. If you're interested, I've posted the playlist down below. You can take a look at it. I want to organize these in such a way that you can start with this particular lecture and carry forward and listen to, it's probably going to be hundreds of hours of audio, to be honest, but in such a way that you can start, have it on in the car, do stuff. Like, I love listening to lectures in the car. Have them on in the car, have them on when you're going for a walk or exercising or whatever, and get the full sort of eagle's eye view of the survey of American literature from the time of the Puritans going to World War II. So take a look at that. Also, if you're interested, I posted 2 other things down below. I have a course on how to graduate college in 2 years. Some of you already know that I graduated with a college degree when I was 19 years old. If you're interested in replicating that, you can take a look down below. I also have another course on the intellectual life, how to develop a good intellectual life, what are the habits of intellectuals. If you enjoyed this lecture and you're going, oh my goodness, how do you know all this stuff? I want to be like this and I want to know more stuff like that. I've organized everything I've learned in the past 15 years into that course, so feel free to take a look at that as well. Give a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you all in the next lecture.